You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavia joining you. It is Thursday, the 20th of March. Happy tournament day, day one, if you don't count the play-in games. Finally, a good play-in game yesterday involving at-large teams as Xavier comes back and knocks off Texas and Dayton. But today we get the full menu of things, and hopefully those of you who are out there watching and listening to the podcast are enjoying those simultaneously. We have a special guest back on the show, Zach Osterman, IU insider for the IndyStar, and we will chat with Zach in just a second here as we've got a ton to cover in terms of the coaching search and everything else that's gone on. But first of all, just a quick reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Home Field had a great special starting yesterday, and I think still going today, Thursday. If you order IU apparel on the Home Field store, you get 20% of those proceeds going directly to Hoosiers Connect, the name, image, and likeness collective for Indiana University. So go support IU NIL and go put yourself in some really attractive IU gear, like this Never Daunted hoodie that I'm wearing right now. Again, homefieldapparel.com. At all other times, use the code HOME23, HOME23, and get 15% off of your first order. Again, Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, and proud supporter of the Back Home Network. Also, just a reminder, we're on YouTube. Subscribe to the Back Home Network and get all the podcasts and notifications and all of that fun stuff. CrimsonCast, Assembly Call, Doing the Work, Dribble Drive, Film Room, just a little bit of everything. So head on over to the YouTube channel. We'd love to have you on in that community and as part of our subscriber base. Over 7,000 people now there. Join the crowd. It's what everybody's doing. All right, Zach, welcome back. It's been a long season for IU basketball, and I wanted to first start off by kind of getting a bit of an epitaph and a post-mortem on the Woodson era, which has now ended after 4 seasons. Indiana barely missing out on the NCAA tournament this year. So 2 times in 4 years, Indiana doesn't make it. And it was certainly a mixed bag in a bunch of different ways. The era seemed like it ended perhaps better than it looked like it was going to end at the beginning of February. But as you reflect back on these 4 seasons with Mike Woodson at the helm, what's your overall impression? What are you left with as far as how this period of time went for Indiana basketball?
Well, first, if there's a video component to this, I hope it caught me having to physically remove my 7-year-old because he was trying to find a piece of a Lego that is not in my office.
This is a common thread on CrimsonCast. Scott's sons do the same thing during the show on a regular basis, so you fit right in.
It's a crisis of substantial proportions. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of funny. Like the Woodson era just feels like it kind of covered a lot of ground in a very short space of time because there were these sort of like distinct storylines that I don't want to say there weren't common threads, but the first year was so much about Indiana has to get back into the tournament. Indiana's got to break this streak. Indiana has to get to a place where it's not, sort of grappling with this almighty struggle just to return to one of college athletics' more forgiving postseasons. And then the second season was, defined by, I think, expectation at a level that no other Woodson season was in terms of, Indiana was preseason Big Ten favorite that year. That was also Trace Jackson Davis's senior year. That was a group that I think, especially by the end of the season, you very much felt like a lot of that was kind of an all or nothing year in terms of, you knew Trace was leaving, Race Thompson was leaving, Miller Kopp was leaving, Jalen Hood-Schifino was leaving. There was just like such a sort of maximize everything about this year. And then I think the last 2 years are the first 2 that feel a little bit more interconnected and maybe not necessarily in a good way, but more, I think, in the end, reflective of, certainly, obviously, what eventually moved Indiana to move on from Mike Woodson or everyone to move on. I know Woodson, sort of announced he was going to step down, but also maybe a bit of a sense that this was not the direction of the program was just one that kind of couldn't be sustained, essentially. And I've covered Tom Crean's 9-year tenure, Archie Miller's 4-year tenure, and now Mike Woodson's 4-year tenure. And it is funny to me how much it seems like we sort of packed into 4 years under Mike Woodson. And I mean that like largely on the court. I'm not talking about controversy or, headlines. I mean like largely on the court. It feels like Indiana, almost endured 3 distinct eras within one 4-year tenure. And maybe that's a little bit reflective of the portal era and how much teams turn over, and the fact that, if there is less continuity, then you are constantly feeling like you're almost kind of seeing each team in its own sort of space and time. But yeah, I mean, I honestly haven't stopped to think that much about, kind of Mike Woodson's 4 years, just because there has been so much going on in the last few days. But that is probably the way I would describe it, is that it does feel like we packed an awful lot into a short space of time.
I mean, I think you hit on something really interesting there, which the portal era. It did feel like in Mike Woodson's tenure, it almost felt like Mike Woodson got hired in a different era, one where you were still focusing on traditional recruiting. NIL as a matter of course was still not a thing. It wouldn't become a thing, really in earnest until, shortly after he got hired. And this last year was a roster assembly like we've never seen in the history of Indiana basketball. And, you've got key players coming in from outside. You had a couple of holdovers who, looked like they were going to become role players. It is really interesting, though, that this season ended up almost getting saved by the guys who stuck around as hypothetical role players, while many of the folks that got brought in through the transfer portal ended up having to play more supporting roles. It's not 100% across the board, but if you don't have Trey Galloway and Anthony Leal playing the way that they play down the stretch, you're not even in conversation probably for the NCAA tournament. So, yeah, it is. I think it's a sign of the times to some degree. I mean, do you think? Obviously, there's a lot of question marks about how Mike Woodson got hired, what that process was like. We've talked about that a bit over time, and that became a big talking point just in terms of the job during this cycle. But it does feel to some degree like if the trajectory of college athletics had not changed, maybe this turns out differently, but it did change. And Indiana suddenly found itself in a spot where it just wasn't measuring up from a competitive level. And that is unfortunately a DNA that it shares with what happened in the Archie Miller era and what looked like it started to happen at the tail end of the Crean era too. And I mean, it almost feels like Indiana's been behind a step for a decade now.
Yeah, I mean, it's also really hard to contextualize Woodson's hiring. Like, number one, Scott Dolson's still in his first year on the job, or maybe I guess just the other side of year one. Number two, COVID. I think we all forget COVID's still going on. I mean, I'm talking with other reporters about what we're hearing at the NCAA tournament in Indianapolis. We're all still wearing masks. Attendance is still, like 1/3 capacity. Nobody had any money then because everybody was wondering just how big the budget shortfall was going to be once kind of all the dust settled and everyone could add up all the money they didn't make on tickets and what they, nobody knew quite what they were going to lose from their TV inventory. So even that felt a little different. And I think it was Scott Dolson, in fairness, trying to embrace some of the more modern aspects of college basketball, even though I think part of the problem was we didn't really quite know what those were. We could guess, the idea, it's going to look a little bit more pro model. It's going to be a little bit more like free agency and year to year. And, but I think that you still didn't know. I mean, NIL didn't come into effect until that summer. And really, I think it's probably fair to say wasn't properly in place until the following spring or summer for the most part, in terms of, schools and what it eventually became their affiliate collectives, kind of understanding how to build up a large scale NIL operation. I remember talking to, let's just say a mutual friend of ours. I think I'm allowed to tell this story. who runs a business and was looking into open doors or one of those things kind of at the advent of NIL. And there were athletes who said that like the starting fee for NIL deals for them was like $15,000. And that was for, like social media posts and things. Like nobody knew anything then is kind of my point. And so, in some ways, there is probably an extent to which like Woodson's tenure almost kind of tracked a lot of the developments of this stuff. And, now Darian DeVries' tenure will kind of bring revenue sharing into it. But I think that you make a valid point about this team and this season about how, I think one of the quotes that really stuck out to a lot of people on Wednesday when Darian DeVries was talking was that a roster isn't a collection of players. It has to fit together. Yeah. And I think there was a feeling, that this roster maybe didn't quite do that. Now, that's always a little bit on the coach and a little bit on the players. And, when we've kind of done our postmortems, one thing I've said, pretty consistently is I think Mike Woodson thought he had this roster in a good place. And then it was clear that he didn't. And it took too long for him to rearrange it in a way that made sense and worked. And ultimately, that's why Indiana kind of comes up just short of making the tournament. But it, in a lot of ways, I think Woodson's hiring is kind of like something unto itself in this program's history because of the place and time that it happened. But his tenure, I think, has tracked a lot of sort of and reflected, as you would expect, a lot of the developments in college athletics that, that we were all probably just kind of trying to get a handle on as they were happening. And now, while we're, now we have this brave new world of revenue sharing, I think everyone is probably able to operate with a little more confidence in the ground underneath their feet. That doesn't mean Darian DeVries is going to, immediately outperform Mike Woodson, but I think that there's going to be a lot less sort of, figuring out as we go along, essentially.
Obviously, we've known officially since roughly the beginning of February that Mike Woodson was not going to return. The timing of that a bit odd historically, given that a lot of times, as we just saw with, say, Texas, Rodney Terry just got fired today or this morning.
I didn't see that. I wondered if he was going to. I didn't.
Yeah, that just got announced. But that's normally when these announcements happen. Kevin Keats right before the ACC tournament. I mean, IU getting a jump start on things. And there was a lot of speculation about the search and the way that the search went. You and Michael Nizolik had a really good article today in the Star regarding kind of the background of that process. And obviously, I want people to go read the article, but it was interesting, how much it seemed to mirror the process that they used to hire Curt Cignetti. But also, I think everybody's curious about how the timing of this actually worked. There was that little segment of the press conference on Wednesday when DeVries mentioned something about Pam Whitten and Scott Dolson being respectful of like him still focusing on his team while things were going on, which seemed to indicate like these talks have been going on for a while. This wasn't something that just happened in the last week.
Yeah, I mean, and I think West Virginia fans have taken it a certain way, and I guess I understand that. I would point out Will Wade literally said he was talking to NC State in a press conference yesterday. And then it was confirmed about an hour later, I think, that he's going to take the NC State job at the end of the year. And a West Virginia fan might say, well, yes, but that's different because he's at McNeese State. And I understand that sentiment too, but the process isn't different.
Right.
And, what is – like I thought about this in relation to the Archie Miller hiring. Indiana dismissed Tom Crean on the first day of the tournament. Archie Miller lost, I think, in his first game that season, or that tournament against Wichita State. Sean played to the second weekend, and the way that the supposed timeline all worked out was Archie joined his family wherever Sean was and said, while they were all just kind of having a quiet moment in a room together, said, hey, I'd love your opinion. I think I got a shot at this IU job. And by the end of the weekend, I remember because I was back home in Atlanta for some reason. By the end of the weekend, it was all done. So you had a timeline of, coach fired on the day the tournament starts. Next coach loses his first tournament game and is hired basically coming out of the second weekend of the tournament. that timeline doesn't exist anymore because of the portal, especially this year. And we don't have to get too in the weeds with it. I know Mike Neislick always rolls his eyes when I start talking about it too much, but I do think it's important for people to understand at least a little bit the April 7th deadline. That's going to be very, very important for roster construction for basketball this year, and the ability to kind of, operate under quote unquote old NIL for one more year.
Right.
That timeline just doesn't work anymore. That sort of, we'll all wait until seasons end, and then, that's when we'll talk to candidates and whatever else. And listen, even before all this, search firms were having some of those conversations, even if athletics directors weren't. But I think what you found is a bit more of an ability. I think this is why search firms have become so much more important, and why you've seen kind of their influence spread, is that I think probably more what you're talking about is the sort of hard and fast conversations.
Right.
You're setting the table so that when everybody sits down, that stuff can happen quickly. That's the stuff that tends to happen, I think, after a season is over. Is the literal in-person, I'm going to sit down with the president. I'm going to sit down with the athletics director. We're going to talk about how this works. But so much of the stuff that used to happen in person, after the fact, or after, between the end of a season and the hiring, just has to happen in a different timeline now. And I don't know for a fact when everyone spoke to everyone, but I don't think you can come away from yesterday with any takeaway other than that yes, Indiana spoke to Darian DeVries at some point while West Virginia's season was still going on. But having said that, that is just the way it works now. And if you aren't prepared to operate according to that timeline, then you're going to suffer for it. Because the other thing, and I would never have said this 5 years ago, but I do think it's relevant now. I think there's going to be an expectation that Indiana should be able to compete pretty quickly here.
Yeah.
You look at like the Ken Palm top 20, you got a Florida team that's in year 2 under Todd Golden, won 30 games. You got a Texas Tech team in year 2 under Grant McCaslin, won 25 games. St. John's in year 2, obviously, under Rick Pitino has been a big story. We can keep going down the list to somebody like Mark Pope.
Did you mention Louisville? Yeah.
Yeah, somebody like Louisville. Even throw in Illinois in the sense that Brad Underwood's been there a while, but that roster turned over completely. And they're still 20th in Ken Palm with 21 wins. They're a 6 seed. Like, that's, you don't have to go out and win a national title in year 1. But the idea that, again, the old timeline of, and this guy's going to come in and he's going to retain a few players, and then he's going to recruit his own guys. And once those guys are sophomores and juniors, that's when you're really going to see the fruits of it. Dusty May is another example.
Yep.
That timeline just doesn't fit anymore. And so you have got to be prepared to move really, really quickly. And Indiana is, I would be very surprised if we're not talking about, by the beginning of next week, staffing being in place, maybe even 1 or 2 transfers, sort of, if not on campus, maybe already committed. We'll see. This stuff moves really fast anymore. That's just the way it works.
We heard Scott Dolson, we heard Pam Whitten talk about why they felt Darian DeVries was a good fit for IU basketball. They talked about a coach that could operate as a CEO. They talked about his process-based nature, again, very, very reminiscent of their comments on Curt Cignetti, and not just their comments, but what we saw out of Curt Cignetti this entire year. From your perspective, not Whitten, not Dolson, but from your perspective, observationally, both with IU basketball and nationwide, do you feel like DeVries is a very good fit for IU basketball? And what is it about him that makes you think one way or the other about how he fits within this particular structure and what IU wants to be?
I think, I can see it both ways. And, on the one hand, I don't know that you would have looked at Darian DeVries, at the beginning of the search and said, that's an absolute home run. On the other hand, number one, I'm very much the person that bangs the drum for the idea that nearly always coaches or programs like this hire coaches that then become, great, become elite in those jobs. Bill Self to Kansas, John Calipari to Kentucky. Those are the outliers. And, and I said this to people, to IU fans I knew at the front end of this process. I said, look what Louisville did last year. Look what Kentucky did last year. Those are programs that are your peers in terms of the way they expect their basketball team to perform, the way they support it, the energy of their fan base, the money behind it. Those are Indiana's peers. And one of them hired BYU's head coach, who probably, if Mark Pope had played his college basketball at UCLA, maybe he might still take the Kentucky job, but obviously that's still very influential in him being the guy there. And the other one hired a coach who'd been at Winthrop and Charleston. So, and they both did great. I'm not criticizing either hire. My point is they both hired coaches that they were going to have to make into what they wanted them to be. And I won't go through the whole list, but history says that is kind of the common path that coaches walk here. If anything, hiring from another high major program is not super common. Now we can also have a philosophical discussion about whether the Big Ten and the Big 12 really operate, on the same playing field anymore. In some ways they don't.
On that real quick, I think some Big 12 schools do. And granted, there's going to be some revenue differences, but I think if you look at like the Kansas, Houston, Arizona, sure, maybe, but this is where the Big 12 is this interesting body, because there's no argument that West Virginia is in that upper echelon. So, even within that, and I think to some degree within the ACC, you've almost got a bifurcation within the conferences about who the haves and the have-nots are.
And I guess what I meant was more, if you're a coach, you're thinking about next year, but you're also thinking about 5 years from now, and 5 years from now, 8 years from now, 10 years from now. The Big 12 and the ACC, I suspect, are not going to feel necessarily like direct competitors to the Big 10 and the SEC financially. And not just financially, like, how much literal money they have, but, for example, how much money they can put into revenue sharing and how they can split it up and how NIL can support different things. So on I look at Darian DeVries and I see reasons why some people might be skeptical or at least cautious. I also just generally think, and I said this at the outset of the search, that, this job to me is a bit of a paradox. And one of the elements of that, one of the core sort of elements of that paradox to me anyway, was that on the one hand, I think it's going to be easier for the next head coach to kind of make the fan base happy quickly, like just find a competitive level that and a consistency that the team hasn't seen, especially like stop getting blown out, like on the road and stuff like that. But on the other hand, I also thought like it was going to be very hard to hire someone that everyone wouldn't look at and be like, okay, prove it, because 25 years of this now, we've tried all these different head coaches. At this point, we're done just kind of blindly buying in. You kind of got to prove it to us, essentially.
Yeah.
That you've got that level in you. And I think both of those things kind of exist. And that's why I think on the one hand, you look at this hire and you say, okay, he is going to have to prove it a little bit. But you look at it on another, and I think there are some justifiable reasons for optimism. So, Tony Adranya, your friend and mine, had a good point, which was that I think in only maybe one of his 7 seasons as a head coach did DeVries not improve his Torvik rating over the course of the season. Now, I think it's a good point. I think it's a little dangerous because the problem is the computers, especially in the portal era, are going to tend to naturally downgrade mid-majors at the expense of high majors, because high majors will spend the offseason bolstering their roster with players that the computers say should make them a lot better. This is why, for example, you've seen Indiana struggle against its preseason KenPom number in the last 2, 3, 4 years consistently under Mike Woodson. But I think Tony's point is valid, which is his teams have consistently gotten better against the formulas that you need to like you to make life easier in February and March in college basketball. And we don't need to get into a debate. I have thoughts on those formulas as well, but that's a conversation unto itself.
You're not a big BPI guy these days.
I think, I mean, my elevator speech is that I think the net, Ken Palm, et cetera, need to be reconfigured for a world with super conferences, because I think what we are seeing here is that you have these conferences that are so large and are so naturally inflated in those numbers by the quality of coaches and players, et cetera, that they just sort of,
it's a closed loop.
Exactly. They feed on themselves, and we say, my God, these conferences are amazing. But the problem is that they're just beating each other. And like, I had a friend yesterday who said, Oklahoma's a 9 seed. They only won 6 games in the SEC. What are we doing? I said, I have bad news for you about Texas. The formula needs to be reworked a little bit if it's saying that 6-12 in any conference is good enough. But set that to one side. I thought one thing that was interesting about Indiana's own analysis, I know Scott Dolson sort of trumpeted the record in close games, and I'm always a little bit skeptical of stuff like that because there's so many things that can turn a close game. But one of the things that struck me was, I think Indiana did this, kind of specifically to make sure if it was looking at a coach who had a big body of work in a mid-major, that they weren't kind of hiring another Archie Miller type where the numbers looked good, but the performances, that the underlying performances were more concerning. Archie won 90 games, I think, in his first 4 seasons at Dayton. He inherited that job from a coach who'd won 97. I think Drake won, if I'm remembering the numbers right. They're in our story. I just don't have them in front of me. Drake won 40 games in the 4 years that preceding DeVries' hiring.
Said they won 9, 7, 7, and 17 in the 4 years prior. Yes.
And he won like 95.
Yeah, he won 24, 20, 26, 25, 27, and 28 in a 6-year span.
So the point is, that what they were looking for is proof that someone built something, not just that they inherited and sustained and maybe sort of refashioned in their own, through their own image or their own philosophies, something that they built something. And DeVries very much did it, Drake. And I know there are people who say, well, it's because he had his son. Well, he didn't for the first 3 years.
Right.
So, and he goes to the NCAA tournament in 2021. There are people who have reservations about his lack of NCAA tournament wins, and I understand that. I don't think that's completely unfair. But here's where I come back to the idea that the job kind of makes the coach a little bit. Danny Hurley had not won an NCAA tournament game for anyone until he won the first one on the road to his first national title. He had been to the NCAA tournament 4 times, twice at Rhode Island, twice at UConn. And he'd not won, unless there was a first 4 game in there somewhere that I don't see. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I take that back. He did win 2 games at Rhode Island.
Right.
Then he went 4 seasons at UConn without winning a tournament game before he won the first game. His first win at UConn was during the 2023 run to his first of the 2 national titles. So my point is, you can kind of see those sorts of things both ways. What Indiana felt like it was confident in was it was getting somebody who had made his own success.
Right.
And West Virginia is a small sample size, but I think a 10-win improvement was the best single season turnaround in that program's history. And, you can certainly see some marker points in West Virginia's sort of metric performances, particularly defensively, from last season to this season. And that was with a pretty substantial roster turnover. And then, of course, he lost probably his best player, Tucker DeVries, his son, after 8 games. So Indiana felt good about the idea that they were getting somebody who was kind of the author of his own success.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at why someone like Darian DeVries might, and listen, Ben McCollum might wind up having a better career, but might, separate from someone like Ben McCollum.
Right. The other interesting aspect, like if you looked at the names that were getting mentioned in the search, I mean, there's other factors at play just besides success. You brought up a really good point earlier, which we brought up on the show as well, which is this is an era of college basketball where if you have the financial backing and you're already getting recruits and you're already having success, there's a bunch more programs that you can potentially win a national title at, or at least get to national prominence than there were 20 years ago. And, as much as people would be like, well, why wouldn't they be able to go out and get like a Scott Drew or a TJ Otzelberger? It's like you can get to a Final Four at Baylor or win a national title, as we've seen. You can get to a Final Four at Iowa State. No one would have. I mean, you grew up in the South. Like, very occasionally an Auburn or an Alabama would have a great season and then settle back into the mire. That's not how it is now. And the idea that you had to get to an Indiana or a North Carolina or a Kansas in order to actually be competitive for a national title, it just isn't the case. So as much as I think for a lot of IU fans, the initial rejection of DeVries, and there weren't as many, the response was actually a lot better than I thought it would be among the fan base. But for those who were skeptical, a lot of it was, well, why couldn't Scott Dolson pull a bigger name? And that's just, unfortunately, I think for a lot of IU fans' egos, like it's just not as important to be at an IU in order to have national success. Why move if you've already got a good thing going where you're currently at?
No, and I think there's a few layers to that. I mean, first of all, like, okay, so look at the teams that won a national title in the 90s. UNLV, Duke, North Carolina, Arkansas, UCLA, Kentucky, Arizona, Kentucky, UConn, and that decade, sort of, if you want to see it this way, wraps off with Michigan State. And then after that comes Duke, Maryland, Syracuse, UConn, UNC, and you don't like it. You're only three real interlopers there are UNLV, which had been so good in the 80s, and 1990 was kind of the
they went to a final 77. Yeah, they'd been good for 15 years at that point.
Arkansas in 94, which was you had a generational coach, and then if you kind of want to see Florida as an interloper again with the generational coach. Point is, you get up into more recent years. Yes, you have your Kansases and you have your UConns, but you've also got Virginia in there. You've got Villanova pulling back up in there. You've got Louisville coming back to a level of prominence that it really had lost for probably 20 years under Denny Crum. And then the other thing you have, I guess that sounded really harsh on Denny Crum. He was a great coach. At the end of his tenure, Louisville had dipped a little bit.
End of his career, like it fell apart. Yeah. Yes,
it was, and Denny was a delightful interview too, by the way. We all miss him, but the other thing that has happened here too is the money has changed in all the ways you would imagine what these programs can do. So, for example, Alabama can pay Nate Oates an amount of money that A, makes it hard to pull Nate Oates out of Alabama, and B, also convinces Nate Oates to say, yeah, you can put an 8-figure buyout in my contract. Because the flip side is, not only are you going to pay me the money I need, not only are you going to pay my assistants the money they need, but like I've heard anecdotally that most SEC programs are going to start at $4 to $5 million in revenue sharing. And I think that at least near term, I think their thought process is NIL can cover the gap in football. We'll put a little more toward basketball than people expect. Obviously, we'll see if that works long term. But there's just more money in, especially the SEC. The SEC is kind of the big one here. Yeah. Again, the Big 12, I think, and I'd point out Indiana did just take a coach out of the Big 12. The Big 12 is one where maybe 5, 7, 8 years from now, it looks different. But the SEC is the one where it's like, Todd Golden, 8-figure buyout. Bruce Pearl, I don't know what his buyout is, but he's incredibly comfortable at Auburn. And Nate Oates has an 8-figure buyout. I don't know what Dennis Gates' buyout is, but I don't think Indiana was necessarily ever as sort of intensely, locked in on somebody.
I think Mark Byington has like a $12 million.
His buyout's 12, if I'm not mistaken.
I mean, that's the Vanderbilt basketball coach has a $12 million buyout. I mean, yeah, that's right. A lot to get your head around.
The point is, both because of the ways that these schools, the money these schools have, allows them, on the one hand, to keep these coaches comfortable and competitive. Whether it's their own salaries, their own staffing pools, their own resources, or it's NIL, it's revenue sharing, whatever. And then it also gives these athletics departments the leverage to be able to protect themselves with enormous buyouts. Mark Pope and Darian DeVries, I believe, are at least publicly known to basically kind of now be the joint highest bought out coaches to be high. Like it's a hiring buyout, not a firing buyout. Pope was at $6 million last year. Indiana's going to be with taxes, I think, just a little bit, and they're also going to assume a little bit of the duty to Drake from West Virginia, so they're going to go a little more than $6 million. I think that's basically about as high. The only one that's possibly higher is Ed Cooley to Georgetown, but we'll never know those numbers exactly because he went from one private school to another. So there are people who think that might be the highest buyout that's ever been paid. These schools just have the money to keep the coaches comfortable and also to protect themselves to not let the coaches get poached. And Illinois would never lose a coach to Kansas now. They would just have too much money to be able to do it.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because there's an argument. I mean, there was a lot of rumors that DeVries was Iowa's number one target and that Iowa just could not come up with enough money on the NIL front. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean Iowa doesn't have money. It means Iowa's spending that money elsewhere. Like they're putting that money towards football. I mean, there's a theory I've heard, and maybe it's been confirmed already, I'm not sure, but West Virginia just hired Rich Rodriguez as their head football coach. They do not have an inexhaustible supply of available money to spread around. And from a cultural perspective, I think you could make an argument that football at West Virginia is just more vital to their culture than basketball. There's a possibility that there were NIL commitments that weren't going to be able to be kept because that money now had to go to support their football program. There are resource allocation issues at a lot of these schools. It's why I thought, even somebody like Tommy Lloyd might be a possibility in the search because of the huge financial issues Arizona's got and the idea that at some point they have to choose where are we putting the money and where is it going to have its biggest impact. So there's a lot of, you bring up a lot of great points. There's a lot of financial data points that end up entering into some of these decisions that the average fan is still not really attuned to or programmed to think about, because I don't even think the industry has really gotten its head wrapped around how all of this is supposed to work and, even how the post-settlement realities financially of college sports are going to shake themselves out.
And where the soft power is compared to the hard power. So, like, for example, the Big 12 right now, if you ask me for my greatest fear about if I'm the Big 12, a fan of the Big 12 or a conference or a team in just a Big 12 fan, I wear a Big 12 cap everywhere. That's a conference without a single program right now that can legitimately compete for a national championship in football. And that is the currency in college sports. It's why the ACC, sort of A, went through a prolonged legal battle, and B, eventually willingly sort of ripped up its previous, revenue sharing structure, not revenue with athletes, but within its own conference, to make sure that it kept the 2 or 3 programs that it has right now that give it currency and agency in a college football playoff world, in a college football playoff conversation, because that is the next great frontier in basically who controls the keys to the kingdom in college athletics. The Big 12 doesn't have that. So if I'm a Big 12 school, to your point, and I've got to figure out how to cut my cloth, I'm probably in most places, maybe not Kansas, maybe not Arizona, but in most places I'm leaning toward football and trying to say we've got to be better at this. Because then you look at like the Big East, for example, where there are people who think there are going to be some Big East, in all likelihood, the Big East schools are going to be the ones with the most money in just raw rev share because they don't have to serve football. They don't have to feed football. But the flip side of that is the Big East is going to have precious little political power going forward in things like tournament expansion, or when the tournament expands, when it's time here in 4 or 5 years to start renegotiating, NCAA tournament television revenues and things like that, how that money gets spread around. And so, it's you have all of these, you have a lot of different sort of constituencies within what we would call in basketball terms, the high major conferences, that basically all look at the same problem trying to find their own solution.
Yep.
The only two conferences that don't really have a big problem, or at least have the least number of problems by far, are the SEC and the Big Ten. And that is why you see, schools, when you see coaches trying to get into those conferences, and why, West Virginia fans might be upset that Darian DeVries leaves after just one season, but Darian DeVries might say, listen, hey, culturally, it's probably a better fit for him, right? He's from Iowa. Like, I heard that when he took the Drake job, part of it was just like, I'm just so happy to be close to my family and yada, yada, yada. But also part of it is just you've got to find your way into one of those two conferences if you can. Use this as an example. West Virginia was rumored to be considering a coaching change in football throughout last season. West Virginia had a prominent alum who was having a remarkable amount of success at a program that historically does not measure up to West Virginia in football, doesn't even really come close, right? If we're talking about, 30 years, 50 years, 75 years, the cultural importance of football at West Virginia compared to where this coach was, what would be perceived to be sort of the infrastructure around those programs. And yet at no point did it ever seem like Curt Cignetti was going to seriously entertain the possibility of leaving Indiana for his alma mater. But the flows reversed almost immediately when Indiana basketball called. Yes, part of it is the prestige of IU basketball, but it's also that life in the Big Ten 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now is a lot more manageable than life in the Big 12.
Final question for you on the podcast today, Zach. Indiana acted relatively early. They get their coach hired essentially 6 days before the portal opens. Do you have any thoughts right now about the timetable from now until, let's say, the beginning of June, in terms of, when do you anticipate we're going to hear news on what the staff looks like? When do you anticipate we're going to hear, and are you surprised we haven't seen more IU players enter the portal yet? And, how would you expect, or how would you suggest IU fans approach looking at the way the roster will likely come together in terms of the timetable over the next 6 to 10 weeks?
Yeah, I think we're probably talking more than that, or fewer than that, right? Like quicker than that is what I'm trying to say. Staffing, I think, will happen relatively quickly. There's different things you got to solve here. DeVries had, by my understanding, a pretty large staff at West Virginia. Indiana had the number one staffing pool in the Big Ten last year. So whether he wants to pull staffers from West Virginia, whether he wants to go hire someone from somewhere else, I think, that's going to happen fairly quickly. I would expect there to be some sort of general manager type person within that, and the thing is, every program has somebody like that. It's just that some programs now are making a big deal of calling it general manager and boasting about how much they're paying that person. Like IU football has I forget what the exact title is, but basically like a director of, like recruiting and player personnel. It's the same idea. It's right. Someone who is trying to be a fence for these are the qualities we're looking for. I'm going to scout all these players. I'm going to bring these players to, I'm the talent evaluator and my staff are the talent evaluators. And we're going to bring these players that we find to the staff, to the head coach. They're going to say, let's pursue him, and so forth. It's the same process.
Right.
It's just that some people are making, I think, and I'm not saying that maybe some of these general managers aren't going to have a little bit more, influence or whatever, but I think there is also kind of an element of, just sort of making a big deal about the title.
Yeah.
When a lot of these programs have someone like that, it just maybe they call it something different. Because let's be very clear that there is a demonstrable difference between a general manager in college who is directly answerable to the head coach and a general manager or a president of operations in the pros who probably has, at least at a fundamental level, the authority to fire the head coach. So you can call him a general manager, but it's not what a general manager is in the NBA or the NFL. As for the roster, I guess I will take people in the weeds with this now because you probably know this. Again, Mike always rolls his eyes when I start into this conversation, but I do think it's important for people to understand. The House settlement is scheduled to be approved on April 7th. It may not be, but as of right now, that's the deadline everyone has to work with. The NCAA has said that its NIL clearinghouse will go into effect April 7th. I don't think it actually opens its doors until like July 1st or June something. But the NCAA has said every NIL deal signed on or after April 7th will be subject to fair market value analysis by Deloitte via the clearinghouse, which means if you sign an NIL deal for $500,000, then if it's on or after April 7th, Deloitte gets to look at that. It gets to look at your profile, your brand, how good you are, how many social media followers you have, whatever, and say either A, yes, for the work done here, for the scope of these deals, that's a fair number. That's his or her fair market value, or B, no, it's not. And then the clearinghouse can reject the deal and basically send it back and say, we don't approve this. Now, everyone obviously expects that at some point someone will challenge the clearinghouse's power to do this.
Billable hours are salivating right now over this.
Then we'll see what happens. But it's everyone is operating or attempting to operate in a world where for the next, what is that, like 3 weeks, basically?
Yep.
It's a little over, it's about 2.5 weeks. For the next like 2.5 weeks, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have NIL the old way, which is you can decide what the number is. Like the number I've heard is that basically it's about 85-15, 85% collective money, 15% like the true NIL that you just go find because you're an IU basketball player or, an Ohio State football player or whatever. So you can have those numbers as they already are right now, but then you can also have revenue sharing, which is going to be, at probably at least a few $1 million at a place like Indiana.
Yeah.
After April 7th, you can have rev share, but the NIL is probably going to be reined in a little bit, at least for now. So I think I know the goal is going to be for everybody, and this is why Indiana making their hire as quickly as it did helps, is you want to get as much of that roster in place as possible by April 7th. And, yes, there are sort of waves of portal players, and do you want to wait for somebody to come off a Final Four team? Or, you always see some mid-major players that go into the portal, declare for the draft, go through the draft process, knowing that they're going to come back out again. Well, here's the thing is the players are going to have to respond to this too, because their agents, their representation are going to be saying, listen, the financial opportunity for you is much greater if we get in ahead of this deadline. So let's get these visits done. Let's get all this. But if you're committed to playing in college next season, I'm just telling you, there is a demonstrable financial difference between the opportunities available to you before April 7th and after April 7th. And so I think you are going to see things speed up pretty quickly on the roster front. The sense I have gotten, and you mentioned only a couple of Indiana players are in the portal so far. Darian DeVries even said yesterday a lot of them are on spring break. The sense I've gotten is that there's an expectation most of the roster will turn over. Obviously, already Indiana was looking at a fair number of outs just based on graduation and things. But I think there were like 9 players that in theory could come back, 2 of whom have gone into the portal. We don't know what Luke Goody's status is, but he'd like to get the year back. I would be surprised if you see more than just a small handful of those back next year. Already, of course, everyone expects Tucker DeVries to come out of the portal to Indiana. I think a couple of other intriguing West Virginia players have hit the portal that I would imagine, like Jonathan Powell's a 6'6" sort of wing shooter that actually played high school basketball at Cape Cups. I wouldn't be stunned if Indiana would like to get involved there. I believe, and this is more tenuous, but I believe Darian DeVries has some sort of connection to Josh Dix, the shooting guard who's in the portal from Iowa. So, there are going to be a lot of names, as there always are, but expect the portal in particular to move quickly because everyone's going to understand that it's going to be easier and for players probably more lucrative to get in before the April 7th deadline and still be operating under the old rules plus the new rules, rather than the new rules and then amending the old rules to just kind of see what happens with the clearinghouse. So staffing, I think, will happen fairly quickly. Roster, I think, is going to move really fast. And if you told me, for example, that, Indiana's already got, half its roster locked down by the end of next week, again, also remember, like, Trent Sisley's still in, maybe a couple currently committed West Virginia signees open their process back up, that kind of thing. I would not be surprised if Indiana's already got a sizable chunk of its 2026 roster kind of sewn up by, let's say, a week from today or a week from tomorrow.
Well, I think that'll be good news for a lot of IU fans, is I think everybody's ready to turn the page. I think everybody's excited to see what the roster is going to look like and what the coaching staff is going to look like. So after a lengthy coaching search, a coaching search that felt like it went on forever as the season was going on, it would be nice to just kind of turn the to the next chapter and let IU fans dream a little bit in the offseason. So, Zach, I appreciate you taking the time to join me on the show, as always, and we'll look forward to chatting with you maybe at the end of the roster cycle to see where Indiana landed on all these things.
No, thanks for having me. I mean, it's been I'm finally kind of coming up for air. It's been a busy few days. So I think we were gonna podcast yesterday, and that turned out to be a fool's errand. So I think we're gonna huddle today as well. So,
well, I appreciate you taking the time to join us, and we appreciate Zach Osterman being on the show, IU insider for the IndyStar, joining us here. Be sure to check out Mind Your Banners and all of Zach's work at IndyStar.com. I'm Galen Clavio for CrimsonCast and the Back Home Network. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.